administration would be able to enforce its executive order in states that don't have lawsuits pending. So that would be, in a lot of the nation, while these cases are bubbling up, that could be a long period of time before the Supreme Court reaches the ultimate question. And in the interim, the administration could, deport a lot of individuals. So that would have a huge effect in the states where these lawsuits haven't been filed.
And so what kind of precedent would that set?
So if the court determines that these nationwide injunctions are unconstitutional, I think it opens up a practice, which is that the administration can, if it wanted to, issue executive orders that are fairly obviously illegal. And then, it could do a lot while it's waiting for the courts to decide, the ultimate question and enforce determine whether or not, the actual executive order is permissible. So, it gives a lot of leeway and legroom for the administration to do whatever it wants to do, regardless of the constitutionality of it, while waiting for an ultimate decision to be made. Because what's actually happening in this case, what the lower courts were trying to do is say, okay, no, this is so clearly unconstitutional that you administration can't, in the interim, enforce it. You can't deport people, but who have what's called birthright citizenship, who were born here, and so a lot can be done in that time. So even though it's quite a technical question, there are huge implications for real people across the nation.
Say one.
All right, Rebecca, stand by because we're going to go to a CBS News special report. We do have a decision coming out of the Supreme Court, so we're going to stand by while we go to that CBS News special report.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York, and we are coming on the air on this, the last day of the Supreme Court term, with a groundbreaking decision from the court that could have a big impact on the arguments around and over birthright citizenship. The justices have just ruled on whether a single federal judge has the authority to issue what are known as nationwide injunctions that block federal policies across the entire U.S. That case goes back to a Trump administration executive order issued back in January to limit who can claim U.S. citizenship from being born, following being born in this country. Jan Crawford is our Supreme Court watcher, and she's at the court for us this morning. She's been reading this ruling, which came out just minutes ago. I understand it's a thick opinion, Jan. What does it say?
Well, first of all, Tony, I think it's important to say right at the top, this is not an opinion about birthright citizenship, about the merits of that issue, about whether or not Trump's executive order is blatantly unconstitutional, as every federal judge says. So put that to the side. This is only a ruling, and it is, I agree with you, a major landmark ruling on whether federal judges have that power, one federal judge, to basically dictate policy nationwide by invalidating a president's initiative. This is not a partisan issue. This is something that's a recently new phenomenon we've seen in the last decade. Presidents, starting with President Obama, obviously the first administration, President Trump, President Biden, all have had to deal with federal judges blocking their initiatives and then implementing it in a nationwide manner. So this is a big win, not only for President Trump, but for presidents of any party, because what this means is, and what the court says in its 6-3 ruling written by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, dividing conservatives and liberals along ideological lines, that this is not how our system is supposed to work. That Congress, when it established powers of the federal judiciary back in 1789, never intended for judges, one judge, to be able to basically set the rule for the whole country. We have an appellate system. They work through the system. That's how the system is supposed to work. So the justices in this ruling today are saying it's not appropriate in most cases. It's got to go about the normal process. But there are ways to get nationwide relief. And the court says today, for example, people can file class actions where that can perhaps apply nationwide. The point is, this is about process, and you got to drive the right car to the courthouse. And here, they didn't do it the right way. So the court's saying, do this the right way, the way the system is supposed to work. That means that I strongly believe, Tony, that there is very little chance that this executive order on birthright citizenship will ever be be implemented. We're going to see people right away next week come back, refile some of these cases, ask for class actions that could be certified across the country. There's a process with that. You will still have some of these injunctions in place. This is just narrowing them a little bit so that they only apply to the parties who filed these cases, not to everyone. So I think it's highly unlikely that this will have any practical impact on that birthright citizenship order ever being implemented. Tony.
All right, Jen, thank you very much. Let's go to our justice correspondent, Scott McFarland, who's been following this as well. Scott, these injunctions have been a tool of those who oppose President Trump's efforts to block them, to stop them. And now it seems like the injunctions will be limited in some way. But Jan says maybe the implications aren't going to be as broad as that may sound. What do you think the implications will be in terms of the relationship between the Trump administration and the federal courts?
Yeah, Tony, it's an important ruling, but it also comes at a uniquely important moment amid a multi-front battle between the administration and the court system, a legal battle and a political battle, too. First of all, the politics. The administration likes to be criticizing the courts. They like to have that issue to push forward their issues of the day, accusing the courts of overreaching and muting the desires of the voters who elected President Trump. But the legal battles have been unprecedented, some of them potentially destabilizing to the balance of power. Just a couple days ago, the Trump administration, in a novel case, sued every federal judge in the District of Maryland, accusing them of overreaching with how they handle immigration cases. The Trump administration, Tony, is accused of not following a court order, also in Maryland, to return Hilmar Abrego Garcia, the man mistakenly deported from Maryland to El Salvador. And the battles are playing out all across the country, a legal showdown in so many places, Tony, between the Trump administration and the federal courts.
All right, Scott, thank you very much. Let's bring in Jessica Levinson. She's a CBS News legal contributor. She's also a professor at Loyola Law School. Her work focuses on constitutional law, election law, and the Supreme Court. Jessica, what do you make of Justice Coney Barrett writing this majority opinion? And a lot of people thought it was going to be John Roberts.
Well, I think it makes some sense given where she is on the court. And I think she was able, obviously, to command more than a simple majority, but a 6-3 majority. In your questioning, during oral arguments, I think you really heard her trying to make sense of this case and be very clear, as Jan said, that it was not about birthright citizenship. It's not about the merits. It's about the equitable power of Congress. Of Congress to grant judges this power. And so she's saying very clearly, if Congress wants to change this, they can. She's also saying very clearly that when people walk into federal court now and they ask for relief of an executive order, they cannot get these universal injunctions anymore. Instead, courts are limited in the scope, the remedy that they can provide. They can provide a remedy of saying to the people who walked in, maybe it's an individual, maybe it's a group, maybe it's a state, maybe it's a class action, as Jan was absolutely correct to emphasize, that the court can give relief to those people. I think increasingly, to your question, Tony, we're going to see Justice Barrett, who I think can speak to all sides of the court, have some of these big opinions. And it's important to listen to how she asked the questions in oral arguments. I think it gave us a roadmap for this opinion today.
All right, Jessica, thank you very much. I'm going to go back to Jan Crawford. Jan, you gave us a great overview of the majority opinion, but you've also been taking a look at the dissents in this case. You've only had a few minutes to digest it, but what stands out to you?
Well, I'm also getting information from Melissa Quinn, who is inside the Supreme Court, saying that Justice Sonia Sotomayor is reading aloud from her dissent. Remember, the 3 liberal justices dissented in this case, even though one of them, Justice Kagan, expressed extreme skepticism about nationwide injunctions when President Biden was in the White House. Now they're in dissent, and their dissent is really focusing on the issue of birthright citizenship and how this was the case that was really suited for a nationwide injunction. Remember, though, as I said, Tony, this has nothing to do with birthright citizenship. No judge that's considered that issue has ever said anything other than it's blatantly unconstitutional what President Trump's trying to do. And I do not believe the justices would ever green light that to go forward. So they're saying that this is the wrong case, that this case should have been one that could be a nationwide injunction. There are a few cases. And that was kind of the point that Justice Kagan was making during the oral argument, that maybe there would be some case that would be suited for a broad nationwide injunction blocking a president's initiative. The problem with that, though, Tony, as the other justices pointed out, is that every federal district court judge is going to think the issues before them are of extreme national importance. So it's not really going to have any impact at all. You have to do something with a little more teeth to it. For example, President Trump is now facing 40 or 50 nationwide injunctions in other cases challenging other initiatives that he has put out there. So I do expect, going back to something Scott was saying, I do expect the administration to file motions to vacate the scope of those injunctions and try to narrow them in all of those cases. And they may win some of those. But I'm just saying in the birthright citizenship case, I'm highly skeptical that this decision today will have any real practical impact on whether Trump gets to rewrite our understanding that citizenship is automatic when you're born in this country, if you're here legally or not.
You know, Jan, people turn to Supreme Court decisions for a definitive answer, and I can imagine some viewers looking at the headline we have in the lower part of the screen that says injunctions likely exceed. What's the work of that word likely doing in that sentence? Why don't we have a definitive does exceed or does not exceed?
You know, looking through the opinion, that's a great question, and that's the language that Justice Barrett uses. I think the opinion itself is pretty clear. I think what we have to remember is there are ways that people can get nationwide injunctions. You just have to do it in the right car. You know, get in the right car. You've got to file a class action. You have to file, you have a claim under a different federal law where you're seeking to vacate a agency rule. You have lived near a factory and you file a lawsuit that's specific to you, the party, but then that helps everyone if the court says no more to the pollution. So I think likely means like let's scale back on these things. There are ways to go about doing it. And Justice Thomas and Justice Alito in their separate concurring opinion make clear that you've got to go and do it the right way, that that's important for the process. And so like this kind of case is no. But, you know, we'll see. I mean, we've seen in some of these Trump cases, as you well know, Tony, that when lower court judges get cases back down to them, they don't always react the way I think the Supreme Court believed that they would react. But I think this one's about as clear as you can get in this case.
All right, and you're as clear as can be as well. Jen Crawford, thank you very much. Jessica Levinson, thank you. Scott McFarland, thank you as well. And just to recap for our viewers, the Supreme Court has ruled 6-3 that lower court judges cannot issue nationwide injunctions in local cases. Quoting from the opinion, which was written by Amy Coney Barrett, quote, when a court concludes that the executive branch has acted unlawfully, the answer is not for the court to exceed its own power too. But they did not rule on the merits of the constitutionality, the question of birthright citizenship. That is a case for another day. We'll be following that as well, of course. Our coverage of this Supreme Court ruling and others will continue on our streaming channel, CBS News 24/7, on your local news, and of course tonight on the CBS Evening News. Many of you will now return to CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York.
All right, you've been watching a CBS News special report. Again, to recap, the Supreme Court ruling just moments ago on the issue of birthright citizenship. Well, not exactly. So let's bring back CBS News contributor Rebecca Roiphe to talk about exactly what this means. So, Rebecca, we sort of teased it in the way that the press has been talking about it. And I think if you're a layperson, if you're watching this at home and you hear that the Supreme Court issued a ruling on birthright citizenship, you're going to go, wait a tick. I wonder what that means for people who are naturalized Americans, or perhaps the people who are the child of immigrants, as I am. But what does this injunction really uphold?
So what the Supreme Court said is not that birthright citizenship is constitutional. That was not the holding today. Very clearly, they did not address that substantive question. Instead, what they did do was hold that when one federal district court hears a case challenging the executive order, it cannot issue an injunction, something that stops the executive order from going into effect across the nation. It just doesn't have the power to do that. So that the executive order now cannot be enforced in those states that have where there are challenges pending, but it could at least theoretically be enforced in other states that have not considered this question. And so what really was decided was something about the power of federal district courts inside states to make decisions that affect the entire nation. And the Supreme Court said the judiciary just does not have that power. It hasn't been given that power by Congress, so it just can't do that.
And so is there, and Jan Crawford, who we're going to get on in just a moment, was talking about the her feeling that that you're not going to see much movement in the way of people, for example, getting deported. But could that happen? And I want to make sure that I understand Jan's argument correctly, but her sense seems to be, as somebody who's not a lawyer, which is that there's going to be filings immediately in the wake of this decision from the Supreme Court. And we're not going to see a lot of movement for the things that perhaps people might be worried about versus the perhaps the celebration that may be coming out of the White House.
Well, I think she's probably right that, you're not going to see the, massive deportation of people who have birthright citizenship. But, I think this is an administration that has very much tried to do this, which is work around the law, like rather than respect the law, work around the law and get through the law and do things, that it might, that it might know it will ultimately be blocked, but do it, because there's some kind of impact that it might have. And maybe the impact is only kind of a scare tactic, but that in and of itself is significant. What this decision really did was give power to the executive. It made it so that the executive has more power than it did before. And, I think that has been traditionally something, not about the Trump administration, but conservative legal actors have been very interested in increasing the power of the executive. And that's what happened today. And so I think it remains to be seen, how much they will really be able to exploit that power at this point. But it's a power that they now have going forward. And I think, that it will affect administrations, again, not necessarily just this one, not necessarily just Republican ones, but, multiple administrations, because it just hands more power to the executive relative to the courts.
All right, so Jan Crawford is actually joining us now to talk more about this. So Rebecca, just stand by while we bring in Jan into the discussion. Our CBS News chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, who's joining me now. So Jan, explain it to me like somebody who took poli-sci because he couldn't get into law school. What does this ruling really mean? And I'm talking about me.
First of all, Vlad, I do not believe that you couldn't. That just shows your good judgment that you didn't go to law school. I do not believe that you could not get it. No, I think what this means, and I'm sorry, I didn't hear some of the conversation you had earlier, but this is really putting the brakes on one federal judge being able to kind of stymie policy from the executive branch across the country indefinitely. I mean, Justice Kagan in 2022 made that exact point, that it can't be right that one federal judge can just come in and block policy, which is what happened, say, in the Biden administration when conservative judges in Texas, where Republicans were filing lawsuits, entered nationwide injunctions, interfering and blocking some of his efforts on immigration, his efforts to forgive student loan, debt relief programs, COVID vaccines. So he was targeted with a number of nationwide injunctions himself, and in fact urged the Supreme Court during his presidency to please rein these things in. It's become increasingly, I completely agree, you see presidents asserting more power because why? There's a dysfunctional Congress. And so, when you have vacuums with immigration or other issues that presidents believe need to be addressed and Congress isn't doing anything, we've seen increasingly a use of executive orders. Now, Trump is, of course, taken that to the next extreme, which is why he's facing 40 or 50 or more of these nationwide injunctions. But what this means is the court is saying this is not how the system works. There is a way to get broad injunctions that will essentially cover the country, but you got to go about doing it the right way. And it can't just be a system where every case is, potentially suitable for a nationwide injunction.
So, Jan, what does that then mean while they go back and do it the right way? While the Supreme Court has issued this ruling, if you are now a judge in Texas, or if you are in Texas and let's say you are one of these individuals who is potentially affected by this ruling, could that mean that tomorrow you could be deported while they try to figure out how to work this way through the system?
No, it doesn't. And obviously, the court is narrowing this injunction. It's still going to remain in place for the 22 states, the multiple organizations with thousands of members, the individual plaintiffs. That injunction will still be in place. You can't do anything against them. But moreover, there's a 30-day pause in this executive order. So there's nothing that would happen in the next 30 days. The Solicitor General made that very clear in the court. The justices were asking, basically, Vlad, your point, like practically what's going to happen. So in that period where nothing's going to happen, this is all on pause, the people will file lawsuits now seeking class action certification. So the justices at argument, and that was one of their big concerns, was, agreeing that courts could move quickly to basically block this, indefinitely, but just doing it the right way, doing it the right process. And obviously the court today was in multiple opinions by the majority, concurrences as well, suggested that this this is a case where it may have very little practical impact in the birthright citizenship case. I expect we will never see that executive order implemented.
So let's bring in Rebecca, Jan, to this discussion, and both of you can sort of weigh in on this. I'm curious now, as we put up on the screen there the makeup of how the court ruled. So what were the liberal justices, Rebecca, arguing? How did they interpret this?
Yeah, so I think what we saw from Justice Sonia Sotomayor and from Justice Jackson was a kind of preview of the ultimate question. So again, to be very clear, the court did not decide about the constitutionality of birthright citizenship, but in the dissents, what you saw was an argument that, okay, yes, there is a proper process, but there are certain cases where it would be appropriate for a single court to issue a nationwide injunction. And the liberal justices were arguing this is just such a case because it's so obviously unconstitutional, because it's so, clearly not considering the constitution or the legality of the executive order. This is where we should allow a court to come in. Now, of course, this is the dissent, so that's not the opinion of the court. But I think that what you see from these liberal justices was a sense not that, we should just willy-nilly allow any district court to issue a nationwide injunction in any case, but that there should be certain cases where it would be appropriate because of the clear disregard that the administration had for the law and the obviousness, how clearly unconstitutional the substance is. So then if you listen to her, she was reading it from the bench, or you read her dissent, you can see some of the arguments that will ultimately be raised, which when, as Jan said, the case reaches the substantive part of the case reaches the court in the appropriate manner.
And Jan, before we move on to some of the other decisions we're waiting for, your take on how the liberal justices saw this.
Oh, I think Rebecca nailed it. I mean, she's exactly right. And that's exactly what Justice Kagan said at the argument. As I said, she's been very skeptical of these things and said that back in 2022 that courts needed to get a grip on them. But she said there could be an important case where they were merited. And obviously the liberal justices believe this was exactly the case, that they should have done it. This was, if you want to scale back nationwide injunctions, do it in another case. That is exactly right. And I think that Justice Barrett writing this decision is really interesting. Obviously, she's come under a lot of criticism from some conservatives who are frustrated with some of her rulings that have gone against Trump. She's a very careful justice, and she is not a justice, which is what frustrates some conservatives, who's going to swing for the fences. She's going to decide the case right in front of her in a generally conservative way. And based on my skim of this opinion, this is a very careful opinion by Justice Barrett that suggests that, setting aside what the liberals have said and the concern they have, that there are ways for courts to act quickly in cases like this.
shades of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who perhaps came into the Supreme Court also with some conservative bona fides, but oftentimes, not a lot, but occasionally.
I think that's wishful thinking by liberals. Yeah, no, she's conservative. I don't see her being one of those conservatives who, but we'll see, Vlad. That's the thing about the court. You know, they'll surprise you in 5 or 10 years.
That's right. That's right. So let's talk about some of the other decisions that we're waiting, because to remind our viewers, this is actually the last day of the term, Jan.
Well, I'm frantically pressing the refresh button, you know, because I've got it on the Supreme Court website, which is where the opinions just pop up when they're being released. We should be getting another one any second. There's 5 left to go in this term. Today's the last day of the Supreme Court's term. There are several that are highly significant cases, including one from Maryland that essentially involves a lawsuit by parents of elementary school children. They say that their deeply held religious beliefs mean they should be able to opt their children out of story time when it involves some of the books that the school board had selected that really kind of embrace gender identity and other LGBTQ issues. That is a big religion case that we should be getting any minute. That's one. But then we have a voting rights case from Louisiana that could be significant on when states can consider race when they're drawing up legislative districts. That's a big case that has practical implications, too, for Democrats and whether or not they're going to pick up additional seats with, you know, Congress so narrowly divided. And then we have a case from Texas about online pornography and whether or not states can impose age restrictions and verification to kind of keep it away out of the eyes of kids. The porn industry is arguing that that violates the First Amendment right of adults, and so the court has to decide if states can ask for that kind of age verification for online porn websites in the interest of protecting children. Pretty much as you have to show, obviously, I mean, this came up in argument. It seemed like Justice was saying it's like common sense. You know, you have to show ID to get into a strip club, to buy a Playboy, to go in the back room of like the adult video section. So why couldn't states require some kind of age verification to get that same kind of material online? I expect Texas will probably win this case, but we'll see. In a matter of the next hour, we'll know, Vlad.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, Jan and Rebecca, that we obviously had the special report around this case regarding birthright citizenship obliquely, but these other 3 cases that you mentioned, Jan, seem to be more consequential to me, at least in the immediate next couple of days, in our immediate futures as Americans. And I name-checked Sandra Day O'Connor. You know, I'll never forget, the very first time that I became aware of how Supreme Court justices could be sort of pithy but also funny at the same time, Potter Stewart saying he doesn't know he knows what pornography is when he sees it. I'm paraphrasing it, but that became the term, right? Like, I know it when I see it.
You know it when you see it. Yeah,
you know it when you see it. Yeah. All right, Jan, Rebecca, stand by while you refresh that Supreme Court website. While we await that, let's go. Are we going to Natalie or to Scott, guys? All right, we're going to go first to Scott McFarlane on this, and then later on to Natalie Brand, who's tracking all of this from the White House. But Scott, let's go to you. You have been standing by. You've been tracking all of this as well.
Yeah, Vlad, first of all, let me just set the scene at the Supreme Court. Pretty muted group here today. This doesn't bear any resemblance to what we saw here last summer when the Supreme Court made that landmark ruling on presidential immunity. But the timing of this ruling is not inconsequential at all. It's the end of the term, but it's also right in the middle of this multifaceted battle the administration is having with the court system. Some of it's legal, some of it's political. The legal cases are frequent and growing across the country. You know, the administration has sued to overturn court orders or just challenge the judges themselves. In a case that was filed this week, Vlad, the administration, through the Department of Justice, sued every sitting federal judge in Maryland over an argument over how the court system in Maryland is processing some immigration cases. They're also accused by critics of defying court orders, including that court order to famously turn around that deportation plane that was headed to El Salvador on March 15th, and not promptly returning Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the man mistakenly deported from Maryland to El Salvador in March. So you have those legal battles, but at the same time, Vlad, there is a political muscle the administration is flexing as it criticizes the courts and overreaches by the courts. One of the top advisors at the White House posted judicial coup on social media when he disagreed with one of the recent court rulings. You can just see here the administration is having quite a time in its first 5 months battling the federal court system.
Yeah, for sure. Scott, we're going to keep you there in front of the Supreme Court because we're still awaiting those 3 or 4 other decisions. But while you stand by, I want to go to Natalie Brennan, who's at the White House for us. And Natalie, you've heard the way that Jan Crawford broke down this decision, and you've heard Rebecca Roife's explanation of the decision when it comes to birthright citizenship. But now you've got the White House and the politics that politicians inject into these court cases. And so the question becomes, you probably don't have reaction just yet from the White House, but how has the president of the United States and the administration been talking about this case leading up to this decision?
Yeah, and Vlad, it is surprising we don't have reaction quite yet. We've been monitoring all of the social media accounts. It's possible that the White House is waiting for the president himself to weigh in on social media, which sometimes happens when you're dealing with big developments or decisions like this. But, you know, this is a victory for executive power and the president's ability to enact policy without a single lower court judge having the ability to block it with a nationwide injunction. And we know that this is something that presidents of both parties have struggled with over past years. Jan alluded to that as well, because we've seen, you know, conservative states or liberal states take action with some of these policies and be able to really set the tone for the whole country. Now, critics warned that with this ruling, you could see a patchwork of different decisions across the country. Something else you've been talking about with Jan and the other legal analysts is this didn't touch the issue of birthright citizenship, which was this executive order that the president signed, right on day one to try to shape his immigration agenda. So we're really waiting to see what happens with next steps here in light of this new major ruling. What actions does the administration try to take on that front? And, overall, in trying to enact other policies, given this major decision by the Supreme Court to really partially block a lower court's ability to stop a policy outright. The argument that we heard during oral arguments was, and in past years, was maybe this should be, the domain of federal appeals panels or the Supreme Court itself. One note, too, in the dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor writes that no right is safe in this new legal regime the court creates. Vlad.
Interesting. Natalie, so you're going to stand by for reaction from the White House. And if you do get reaction and you're still standing in front of that camera, you can do the Gayle King wave, which is the wave to the control room that you've got some news to report, and we'll come straight to you. Natalie Brennan for us at the White House. Let's go to CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson, who's also standing by to talk more about this. So I want to dig a little deeper, Jessica, into the dissent. And you just sort of heard what Natalie said there in quoting from Justice Sotomayor's dissent. I'm just curious if what you're seeing in just that sentence that she quoted to me, which is that certain justices of the Supreme Court recognizing that we live in a very politically charged time that is perhaps different than times previous, and that calls for a more, I don't want to use the word thoughtful, but a different approach to how these justices think about the letter of the law. Understanding, of course, that there are some of those justices who sit on the bench who are strict and, that when they look at the Constitution, they interpret it exactly the way it's written, and there are others who feel differently.
Vlad, I love this question because in my mind, and obviously it's a very lengthy dissent and I'm just trying to get into it, but this is a vintage Sonia Sotomayor dissent where she's saying, look at what is going to happen on the ground now. And I would say right off the bat, the conservative justices and others, I think, would say the practical impacts that she's concerned about may not happen. But I will say, as somebody who teaches her opinions, this is very much consistent with the way she writes, which is look at what will happen to individuals on the ground today. And she spends, as far as I can see, the beginning of her dissent really focused on this question of birthright citizenship. I'm sure you've talked to Jan and Rebecca about the fact that this case really wasn't about birthright citizenship at all. In fact, it was about the scope of relief that federal judges can provide when somebody walks into the courtroom and says, there's a problem with this executive order. And I don't think that there is a majority of the court not near it to say that this executive order about birthright citizenship would be constitutional. But you do see, I think, this fascinating divide where Justice Sotomayor is spending a lot of time talking about what happens to people who are pregnant right now. Will we have stateless children? And this is really what she has done in other areas. Think about affirmative action, think about abortion, think about immigration. And then we have different opinions looking at the implications of what would happen under the law if we give federal judges the power to do this. It's a very different reading of the consequences we're worried about. It's a very different reading, in some ways, I think, of the power of federal judges.
Jessica, let me ask you about some of these other cases that we're waiting for, including the one that has to do with children's books. And it's so interesting. And you know, people can be mad at me, but, you know, 3 years ago, before I had a baby, I probably wouldn't have thought much about this. It wouldn't have affected my life much. But I am curious as to the merits of this case, how it started, and how you feel the justices might rule on this one.
So this is a case involving whether or not parents have, under the First Amendment, the Free Exercise Clause, a right to essentially have notice and opt out before their children are read certain books. In this case, about LGBTQ families, I believe, were the main books that we're talking about here. And Vlad, to your point, I heard Supreme Court justices saying the same thing, which is life experience matters. I heard Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who has a number of school-age children, saying something like, you know what, these are real important questions. And I think it matters. And this is true in another case, dealing with another case that, as far as I know, we're still waiting on, dealing with whether or not age restrictions in Texas in order to get onto websites that have adult content are permissible. But when it comes to this question that you asked me about, and it comes to the parents who are saying we need notice, we need an opt-out before our children are read certain educational materials, I think the court is going to rule with the parents. I think the court felt that there should be some sort of opt-out for them. And the question, of course, is how they craft that opinion so that it does not allow parents to say, we don't want our children to have basic education in U.S. history, in math, in science, but it does allow parents with genuinely held religious beliefs to say, we don't want our children to hear this type of educational material. That will be difficult for them to craft that opinion.
Yeah, I do think that's sort of interesting that you say that, Jen, because my first thought went to, okay, well then if the court then rules that parents can have the opportunity to opt out of that story time, for example, if it has material that they don't feel comfortable with for religious reasons, what's the line when you say, hey, let's talk about enslaved people in this country and what that meant and what that has meant for this country? What about Jim Crow? All the things that you're starting to sort of hear now that people kind of don't want to talk about, that they don't want to teach in schools. What would be that line for a parent to say, you know what, I don't want my kid to hear about what it was like to be enslaved in this country, because they're too young to understand that, and where the line would be drawn in that way?
Well, Vlad, I hate to give you this answer, but we're going to know in 7, 10, 17 minutes. I don't know, but we will see how, if I'm right in the prediction. And I don't know if Jan can still hear, but I think that we both listened to oral arguments and believed that the court was likely to side with the parents. It's important to know in this case, the school previously did have an opt-out provision for the parents. They took that away. And I think what the court was saying here is, allow that opt-out. It's not too much of an administrative burden. To your point, though, I think this is going to be the hard part for the court, right? Saying that you have to allow parents this opt-out, but you can't allow parents to say, don't teach evolution.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. All right, we're going to continue this conversation, Jessica, on the other side of the break. Let's take a quick one right now, and we'll come back to you. You've heard the first decision that's been out this morning from the Supreme Court of the United States. We're tracking all the other ones, so stick around for that. They're coming down any minute. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
What happens when reporters take you inside the story?
I've been asking for over a year and a half for access into this place, and this is the first time we're getting it.
You get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight.
This is CBS.
This is NCIS. You put on that uniform, you agree to protect the person next to you, no matter what. Welcome to Australia.
Match made in heaven.
Watch out! Hey, hungry? Shout you a crock burger.
NCIS Sydney. All episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus. Returns CBS Full.
I'm Erin Moriarty of 48 Hours, and of all the cases I've covered, this is the one that troubles me most. Listen to Murder in the Orange Grove, the troubled case against Crosley Green, wherever you get your podcasts.
Be in the know, even when you're on the go, with the CBS Mornings podcast.
Some news you can use at the grocery store.
Better mornings start better days.
When you look good, feel good, you do good.
That's right.
Listen to CBS Mornings on the go on Apple Podcasts.
What happens when the world's best journalists come together?
Write a prescription for the healing of America.
We're retired and this is our paradise.
Now it's gone.
You get the stories of America every night. You get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight.
I can only describe it as evil.
Follow and listen to Train to Kill, The Dog Trainer, The Heiress, and The Bodyguard on the free Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts.
My job can get dangerous sometimes, but I'm very good at what I do. I know you're scared. I'm here to help.
They said you were the best.
Your daughter hired me to bring you home. I made her promise I would never stop looking.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You hear about the reward?
Come in.
Okay.
Tracker. All episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus and returning CBS Fall.
All right, the Supreme Court ruling moments ago on the issue of birthright citizenship. These are the three cases that we are waiting on right now. So let me break them down for you. The first is Mahmoud versus Taylor, a case about LGBTQ books in the classroom. Louisiana versus Calais, which is about a voter redistricting map. And Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, which would place an age restriction on adult websites in Texas. So our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, is joining us now from Washington, D.C. To talk a little bit about this. Jan, you're refreshing the SCOTUS site. Anything yet on those three that we're waiting for?
We had a big one. Literally just dropped, Vlad.
Break it down for us. It's breaking news.
Oh, I haven't read it yet. It literally just went up on the website. It is a decision. I'm going to tell you just the top headline. It's a decision in the case about parents and whether or not they can opt their elementary school kids out of that story time. It's written by Justice Alito, and it says, just at the top, that yes, they are entitled to do that based on their sincerely held religious beliefs.
So, Jan,
that
why
it's
don't you
no
continue?
answer.
Why don't you take a look through that?
The parents, as Jessica was predicting, the parents win.
The parents win on that. All right. So, Jan, while you go through that decision, I don't want to have you on camera while you're sort of reading and taking it all in. But let's bring back Jessica Levinson just again to refresh our viewers' memories. If you're just joining us now on CBS News 24/7, we, before the break, were talking about this decision, this very decision that has just come in now from the Supreme Court regarding parental opt-outs for LGBTQ books in classrooms. Jan, again, for people who are just joining us now, because I can see the push alerts going out on social media that we do have another decision from the Supreme Court. So just recap for our viewers what was up for a decision, and then we'll go back to Jan and for a debrief on it, and then we'll come back to you for your take.
Sure. So I think I maybe got 3 more words than Jan was able to look at here. The bottom line is that the parents lodged a First Amendment claim saying that it violated their free exercise clause rights to not have notice and an opt-out provision when their children were read LGBTQ inclusive educational materials at school. Justice Alito wrote the opinion. It looks like it is exactly as we talked about a few moments ago, Vlad, a win for the parents. I saw very briefly the majority saying that parents have genuinely held beliefs and that it substantially infringes on those beliefs not to provide them with notice and an opt-out when certain materials are read to their parents. I think this is part of a larger theme of this court being very protective of the rights of religious objectors and protective of free exercise clause rights. Vlad, as we talked about before, I think the fascinating part of this will be looking to see exactly how the court creates the standard for determining when parents are entitled to notice and an opt-out. I think my guess, again, looking extremely fast, which is that the court is going to stay fairly close to these particular facts and try and highlight that this is not open season for parents to start saying, we don't want our children to hear X and to hear Y and to hear Z, because you do want to provide school boards with some ability to dictate their curriculum. So again, this case, as we talked about before the break, I think predicted a win for the parents, a win for those claiming that their free exercise clause rights are infringed upon. And again, the real question here will be how the opinion is drafted in order to make sure that school boards can still dictate large portions of their own curriculum.
All right. Jessica Levinson there for us. Jessica, stand by. Jan, back to you. Jessica and I were talking earlier, you as well, about how this could potentially go. And it's just as you predicted, the justices siding with the parents.
Right. And this one was 6-3 with the liberals also in dissent. Jessica, she's obviously so brilliant. She's always getting it right. I mean, this is an issue that this Supreme Court has been really concerned about, kind of the people's ability to kind of freely express their religious beliefs. And the court, in his opinion, Justice Alito essentially says that, the First Amendment protects parents from having to make the choice of, sending their kids to a private school if they don't agree with some of the potentially religious messages that they feel they're getting that could contradict their religious beliefs. It's interesting because this case, the way it's come about, and I thought at argument why I was confident that the court was going to rule for the parents, the justices actually read the books that were at issue. There were half a dozen books that teachers were instructed they could pick from to read to these elementary school students. And they specifically asked about a number of these books during the argument. And while it was kind of portrayed as books with LGBTQ themes and characters, some of the books the justices suggested went well beyond that to actual, almost as someone suggested, indoctrination. And Justice Alito has attached pages from some of the books in the back of his opinion as an appendix, pages that say that kids can pick their pronouns, that they should be able to decide if they want to be a girl or a boy, embracing the idea that gender is fluid. I think that had a pretty big impact on how the justices saw this case. I think it's a narrow ruling. I agree. I don't think it's going to have a real impact to your concerns earlier, but we'll get through that one and talk about that in an hour or two.
All right, Jan Crawford for us, reporting from our bureau in D.C. As always, Jan, great to have you. Thank you so much for sticking around with us. We really appreciate it. All right, let's go to Scott McFarland, who's outside of the Supreme Court for us this morning. And so you just heard a little bit of Jan breaking down how the conservative justices ruled and how they felt about this case. Scott, what can we discern from how the liberal justices ruled?
Yeah, Vlad, pretty dense opinion, 135 pages, a pretty meaty dissent here. I was also struck by what Jan mentioned and what we see in this ruling. They actually have pictures of the books in this ruling, images from some of the pages in the books referencing same-sex marriage or gender dysphoria. In the dissent, Justice Sotomayor makes a number of arguments, one of which is pretty practical, that schools have a tradition of allowing students to opt out of certain courses, certain classes, certain larger scale programs the schools offer, but letting them out of certain conversations, certain ideas, certain themes. That may just be untenable for the schools, a remarkable burden for school districts, for principals, and for the teachers who are trying to execute a lesson plan. If it begins with issues of same-sex marriage and gender dysphoria that schools must give children and parents an right to opt out of, what's next? What else can they opt out of if they disagree with the premise the teacher is making in the lesson plan? A practical argument in addition to the constitutional argument Justice Sotomayor includes in her dissent, Vlad.
All right, Scott McFarland standing by for us at the Supreme Court. Let's go straight to Natalie Brand, who's got some breaking news out of the White House. Natalie, what can you tell us?
Vlad, we're hearing that there's actually going to be a news conference here at 11:30. It was just announced by the president himself via Truth Social as he's really celebrating the Supreme Court decision. I'm not sure if we have that Truth Social to pull up for you, but he's calling this a giant win in the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that even the birthright citizenship hoax has been indirectly hit hard. He's saying that it had to do, quote, with the babies of slaves not scamming our immigration process. Congratulations to his attorney general, solicitor general, who argued the case before the Supreme Court, and the entire DOJ. So again, we are expecting now to hear from them. There's the social media post that we just received. Next hour at 11:30, after this major ruling in which, again, the justices did not rule on the merits of birthright citizenship, which is protected by the Constitution's 14th Amendment, but they ruled rather that a lower court judge cannot block a presidential policy nationwide. This was a ruling on nationwide injunctions, but it's certainly a victory for presidential power, and the president seems to want to be taking a victory lap here. Again, he's expected to speak with his justice team next hour.
All right, Natalie Brand for us at the White House, where, as Natalie just pointed out, the President of the United States is expected to hold a press conference at about 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, later, just about a half hour from now. And so we'll obviously carry that live right here on CBS News 24/7. That does it for me, folks, for the news that we've been bringing to you all morning long. Again, the Supreme Court ruling in some major landmark decisions this morning, and there's still a couple more to go. So obviously when that happens, we're going to bring it to you live right here on CBS News 24/7. But coming up next, Mugo Odiwe is live from San Francisco with all the news breaking from coast to coast. This is CBS News 24/7.
What happens when reporters take you inside the story?
I've been asking for over a year and a half for access into this place, and this is the first time we're getting it.
You get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight.
This is CBS.
This is NCIS. You put on that uniform, you agree to protect the person next to you, no matter what. Welcome to Australia.
Welcome in. I'm Mugo Odigwe. We have all eyes on the Supreme Court this morning for their last day in session. We know justices handed down their final 6 decisions, and they include some landmark cases. So let's break down which legal showdowns we are watching. Perhaps biggest of all, a bombshell opinion that gives President Trump a win in his bid to enforce his executive order. And that order denies birthright citizenship to U.S.-born children who have parents in the country illegally. Now, notably, it was a partial stay on the nationwide injunctions against the Trump administration's actions, but not a ruling on the merits of birthright citizenship. More on that in a bit. And a win for Maryland parents in a religious rights case over LGBTQ storybooks in public schools. The court says they can pull their children from public school lessons that use LGBTQ storybooks in those lessons. Let's begin there with CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford. Jan, thank you for joining us today. I know a busy day as the Supreme Court puts out those rulings. The justices didn't rule on the merits, as we said, of birthright citizenship, but this is still very much a landmark ruling. Can you take us through the decision and what it means?
Yeah, and you're so right to kind of point that out right at the top, Mugo, because there is a lot of confusion about this case. And it was part of a challenge to that executive order on birthright citizenship that President Trump issued on day one. When people filed lawsuits against that executive order, 3 federal, in this case, 3 federal judges, one in Washington State, one in Maryland, and one in Massachusetts, didn't just rule on the issues involving the parties and the states before them. They made their rulings apply nationwide across the board to everyone. So that was the issue in the case. Can one federal judge essentially dictate policy nationwide? And in its opinion today, 6-3 ruling by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court said this is not how the system was set up to work. Congress did not authorize this. Federal courts don't have this kind of, federal judges don't have this kind of broad power to enter these kind of injunctions. And, you know, any case that they think it is important, you have to go through processes. There are ways to get nationwide injunctions, but you got to do it the right way. You got to do it a different way. So, you know, this is a big win for President Trump, no doubt. But it's also a win for all presidents because President Biden asked the Supreme Court to do away with these things. President Obama complained when he was in office about these kind of nationwide injunctions because what happened when a Democrat's in the White House is that Republicans go and, you know, conservative states like Texas find a judge who's sympathetic to them and get that judge will enter an order blocking their initiatives on immigration or student debt loan relief or COVID mandates. So we saw that throughout the Biden administration. So today the court is saying, no, not in every case. You can get nationwide relief, nationwide injunctions, but you got to do it the right way, like maybe file class actions, for example. So that means that this case, while really significant legally in terms of the process and kind of putting the brakes on this relatively new thing we're seeing federal judges do, it really might not have any practical implications for those challenges to birthright citizenship, because I expect that in the states that now, you know, where the litigation hasn't been to the point where judges blocked it, you're going to see lawsuits seeking class action status where people will be able to pretty quickly block this executive order indefinitely. I do not expect this executive order to ever take effect.
But Jan, when it comes to the nationwide injunctions question of all of this, what does this ruling mean for the balance of power between the president and then the judiciary?
Well, according to the Supreme Court and the presidents over the last 10 years, these federal judges are exceeding their authority, and that's what the court ruled today. That there's Congress authorized federal courts to have this kind of jurisdiction back in 1789. It was never part of what they were authorized to do, which means Congress can always go back and change the law if they want to, which obviously they're not going to do. The reason this has become such an issue over the last 10 years is because Congress doesn't do anything. They're totally dysfunctional. They don't, fix the immigration system. They're unable to make any decisions. So presidents, as Obama did, as we see, they feel like they've got to step in and issue executive orders, whether it's on immigration like Obama did with the Dreamers. And so that's what then, federal court judges who are perhaps a different ideology are trying to put the brakes on. So yes, presidents have been starting to exert more authority with executive orders. Judges have then asserted more authority that the court today said they don't necessarily have. And whose fault is all of this? If Congress would do its job, we wouldn't even be here talking about this right now, Mugo. But I can say that with almost every case.
I mean, that is a good point, a very, very good point indeed. I want to ask you about the dissenting opinion, those minority opinions. What are your thoughts on them? We're looking at something here on the screen from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. It says the court's decision to permit the executive to violate the Constitution with respect to anyone who is not yet sued is an existential threat to the rule of law. Wanted to get your thought on that. We also have another opinion here. This is from Justice Sonia Sotomayor. It says the government does not ask for complete stays of the injunctions as it ordinarily does before this court. Why? The answer is obvious. To get such relief, the government would have to show that the order is likely constitutional. Again, wanted to get your thoughts on those opinions from the justices.
Yeah, and Justice Barrett answered that in her majority opinion, suggesting that there are other ways that people could get this kind of relief that would apply nationwide, and courts can act very quickly. That's why I don't think you're going to see this order ever being implemented, because every judge that's taken a look at it has said what Trump is suggesting here is blatantly unconstitutional. The liberals and Justice Kagan among them are saying that if there was ever a case to have a nationwide injunction, it's this one. So what are you doing, majority decisions? And Justice Kagan made that point at oral arguments. She had been critical during the Biden administration of these nationwide injunctions. In fact, she said during a talk in 2022 at Northwestern Law School that it just can't be right, as she put it, that one federal judge can essentially grind to a halt a president's initiative and keep it blocked indefinitely. So that was in 2022. Now she says at argument but there may be one case or two cases or a few cases where that would be okay. The concern with that the other justices have, Mugo, is that every federal judge that gets an issue is going to say, this, of course, has nationwide importance. This, of course, could affect, thousands or 100,000s of people across the country. So I'm going to enter a nationwide injunction, too. There will be no real teeth to that. And that's why the majority declined to kind of carve out those kind of like in the big, really big case that'll affect everybody. They refused to do that kind of exception. They said there's other ways to get it, just like drive a different car to the courthouse, so to speak. File a class action. You can get a nationwide injunction that way. And that's what I think we'll see starting next week.
Yeah, and Jen, I have to ask personally, because if this has been a problem with the Obama administration, the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration, why has it taken this long for the Supreme Court to have to decide on it?
That's a great question, and the court should have taken this up back in December of 2024 when the Biden administration's Justice Department asked it to. Trump also complained about it in his first term, and so why did it have to wait until this case to do it? I think there's 2 points. The judiciary system typically, the Supreme Court, they like to be a court of review, so that they typically take cases where lower courts have divided, where they're split on an issue. And so we haven't had a lot of writings in the lower courts on whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea. We've just had a lot of lower courts saying nationwide injunctions, let's go, because like I said, conservatives like nationwide injunctions when, the Democrats in the White House. So, you haven't had people necessarily challenging them. And we did have it in this case. We have a dissent, a dissent in the Maryland case. A federal appeals court judge said these nationwide injunctions are totally inappropriate. So who knows why they decided to take this one? There are other technical reasons, I think, that they agreed to do it. But the point is they're sharply putting the brakes on these things. And as you said at the top, the bottom line, this does not impact, I do not think, it is not about the merits of nationwide citizenship. It does not mean that Trump is right about that. And in fact, Trump is not right about that, as every single court has said. So I think there's nothing in today's ruling that means that executive order will be implemented, and people are going to have to start showing citizenship papers in the maternity ward. I don't see that happening.
Okay. And there is another major ruling on the use of LGBTQ themed materials in schools. What did the justices decide on that case?
This is one of the bigger cases of the term as well. And it's one that I think you can have, one of these cases where you can kind of have sympathy for both sides. Both sides of parents came in. It came about when a school district in Maryland, in Montgomery County, which is just connected to Washington, D.C., very progressive county. They said, this is life. We need storybooks that feature, a gay dad or a gay couple. So they worked to try to introduce half a dozen or so books into the curriculum. Then you had parents with deeply held religious views, many of them immigrants, who said, this goes against my religious beliefs. And so that's how the case got to court. They sued, saying not to ban the books, but just that they wanted to be able to opt out their children, elementary school children, when these books were being read during story hour. The reason I knew the parents were going to win this case, that with the religious objections, which they did in an opinion 6-3 by Justice Alito, the parents won. They will be able to opt out of these lessons, is because the justices read the books. Initially, it kind of been presented as, this is just LGBTQ characters and themes. But some of the books, the justices suggested, oral argument, go way beyond that and actually indoctrinate kids to believe, they said, that you get to pick your gender, that gender is fluid. And Justice Alito, in his opinion, has actually attached copies of the pages that they're referring to. So that, I think, means and helps us think about this case, it's probably going to be a pretty narrow case. I don't think it'll have any impact on anything involving, could you opt out of history lessons or other lessons. My guess is it was just the nature of the facts of this case and some of the books that they were using, and that's what drove some of the objections, and I think that's what also drove the majority decision in this case.
Okay, CBS News Chief Legal Correspondent Jan Crawford, thank you so much for walking us through all of that and for your analysis. We really appreciate it. Let's turn now to CBS News legal contributor Tom Dupree. Tom, thank you for joining us today. I want to ask about that ruling about the nationwide injunction. How does it affect the balance of power between the presidency and the judiciary?
It's an enormously important opinion, and it does redefine the balance of power between the president and the courts. The Supreme Court basically said that a single federal judge generally does not have the power to issue a nationwide injunction, which can freeze a president's order in its tracks across the United States. I think one consequence for this is going to be you're going to see a lot more litigation, because the Supreme Court basically said if you are trying to get an order that stops a president's action across the country, you basically have to file either a class action lawsuit or just a lot of individual lawsuits. So there is still the possibility of getting an order of this scope, but the Supreme Court made it far more difficult to do so, and in a way that will benefit the power and increase the power, not just of President Trump, but of all the presidents that follow him.
And we understand the Trump administration, they took this case to the Supreme Court asking about birthright citizenship, but then the question was really narrow. Why do you think they chose to do that?
Well, Justice Sotomayor accused the Trump administration of gamesmanship. She said that the reason why the administration only went up to the Supreme Court on the question of the nationwide injunction and not the question of birthright citizenship is because they didn't want the court to decide the constitutional question of birthright citizenship, at least at this point in time. So from Justice Sotomayor's perspective, the administration made a strategic decision to avoid getting a ruling on the merits of whether what President Trump did is constitutional. So that question is one that will continue to be fought out in the lower court. So far, pretty much every court has rejected it. But ultimately, someday, it will wind up making its way to the United States Supreme Court for a final decision.
All right, Tom Dupree, thank you for your analysis. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
And now let's bring in CBS News Justice correspondent Scott MacFarlane, who is at the Supreme Court. Scott, thank you for your time today. Can you break down what this ruling means when it comes to the power of the judiciary to check the powers of the president?
That's a victory for the administration now and future presidential administrations that don't want to see any controversial executive orders or rulings against them from the courts in their controversial executive orders. That notwithstanding, it's especially impactful at this moment because as of this week, as of the end of this week, there are more than 450 lawsuits challenging Trump administration decisions, personnel moves, or executive orders. A lot of footholds for the court to get involved and issue injunctions. That notwithstanding, some of the states are part of those efforts to challenge the Trump administration in court, and it's unclear that this ruling would stop a coalition of states from trying to get a nationwide injunction from the court system. But it's also part of a bigger issue here, isn't it? There's a political issue the administration has been trying to mechanize in its criticism of court rulings, saying that the courts are stopping the will of the voters, that the courts are slowing the administration from trying to execute immigration enforcement, new border security initiatives. They have been a foil, the courts have, for the administration's political goals, and this means this ruling is quite a victory for the administration.
And Scott, I want to pivot to a different topic here because lawyers for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, they have just asked a judge to keep him in federal custody. Can you give us an update on this case?
Yeah, speaking of the courts, there's that matter of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who really has become the face of this battle between the administration and the court system in Nashville, where Abrego Garcia is charged with federal human smuggling charges. His lawyers have said they want him to remain in pretrial detention in Tennessee. That is a unique argument for a defense attorney to make, but they're citing some conflicting guidance they're getting from the administration. Some people in the administration say they want to deport Abrego Garcia to a third nation, not El Salvador. And there are others in the administration saying, no, they want to keep Abrego Garcia as they continue with that federal criminal prosecution in the Middle District of Tennessee. Amid all that lack of clarity, the defense says, let's just keep him where he is now for a couple more weeks and continue this battle in the courts.
All right, Scott MacFarlane at the Supreme Court for us. Thank you so much for that update. And as we've told you, it is the Supreme Court's last day in session, and we are watching their latest decisions. In one of the biggest cases, the justices voted to limit lower courts' power on nationwide injunctions, including that of President Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship. So let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Aaron Navarro for more. Aaron, you're out there at the White House. I see you. So any reaction from the White House about the decisions so far?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that come in now. The president posted on Truth Social calling that decision, quote, a giant win, saying it, quote, indirectly hits the birthright citizenship, argument. Even though, as Jan noted, this decision from the Supreme Court mainly deals with national injunctions and not the merits of birthright citizenship. The president went on to say that birthright citizenship is, quote, scamming our immigration process, and also said that there would be a press conference at the White House in the briefing room around 11:30 a.m. But, the White House for months now have been arguing that lower courts have too much power, especially as they've seen a lot of their agenda items when it comes to this case on birthright citizenship, when it comes to their efforts for massive reductions in force across several federal agencies. You've seen lower court decisions really stymie the progress the White House wants to see. The fact that, it's a bit more of a restrictive process for lower courts to get a nationwide injunction is certainly welcome news, at least from what we're seeing from the White House.
And I want to ask you about a different topic here, because President Trump said that there was a trade deal signed with China and a possible upcoming deal with India. What do we know about this right now?
Yeah, the president during the event with congressional Republicans yesterday at the White House referred to it as a deal with China. A White House official later added on that it was, quote, a framework. As I understand it, this is just the next step in the process between U.S. and China in their efforts to reach a full-out trade deal. There was a meeting in London earlier this year that set a, quote, framework for negotiations. As I understand it, the latest development is that that framework has been formalized. And just to kind of outline what each side gets, what the U.S. gets is something that this administration has been pining for, which is easier access to rare earth materials in China. These are materials that can be used for electronics, smartphones. What China gets is the U.S. not revoking visas of Chinese nationals on U.S. college campuses. What both countries get is that those big tariffs that we were seeing, over 100% earlier this year, those will continue to not be implemented. On India, that's another crucial partner of the U.S., but for weeks now, we've heard White House officials, the administration say that India is close to a deal, that South Korea is close to a deal, that Japan is close to a deal. So we'll see if there's any fuller details on that. And you're starting to see some officials at the White House suggest that that timeline of July 9th for the president's kind of deadline for these, quote, reciprocal tariffs could be extended. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent kind of addressed this during an interview with Fox. Take a listen. Oh, sorry. Yep, don't have that bite. But in general, what Bessent suggested is that he just wants deals done by Labor Day. So certainly an extension of that timeline, which is rapidly approaching as we get closer to July 9th.
Yeah, Aaron, Labor Day makes sense because July 9th is really just around the corner. Aaron Navarro at the White House for us. Thank you so much for that. Okay, let's go back to CBS News legal contributor Tom Dupree on more cases coming out of the Supreme Court. Tom, what else are we getting right now?
Sure. Well, the Supreme Court just decided one big case and punted on another. The one big case they decided was a challenge to a Texas law that basically imposed age verification requirements for people who wanted to access porn sites on the internet. The Supreme Court considered a First Amendment challenge. Basically, adults were challenging the law, saying that these age verification requirements infringed on their First Amendment rights to read content that they wanted to see on the internet. The Supreme Court reviewed the law and upheld it. They said the law was constitutional. They applied what's known as an intermediate scrutiny test, which was not the test that the challengers were arguing for. They wanted it to be reviewed under a more strict standard of review, but the Supreme Court applied an intermediate standard of review and held that Texas's law was permissible and survived constitutional scrutiny. The other case the Supreme Court just punted on was a challenge to Louisiana's attempt to redraw its congressional district maps. They had been challenged under the Voting Rights Act, that they diluted the power of black voters. The Louisiana legislature had made several efforts to redraw these maps. None of the efforts passed muster. They kept getting it sent back to redraw. And in the latest version of this, it went up to the Supreme Court. It was argued, and the Supreme Court just said, we're not going to decide it. We're going to decide it next term. We're going to have another argument in the case, so stay tuned. But we're not going to resolve this case until we hear more argument, and we'll decide it sometime next year.
So basically, they're just waiting to take a break, come back, and then hear more arguments from lawyers from both sides. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. They're ready to go on their summer vacation now, and they say this Louisiana case is so complicated and so thorny, we can't decide it today. Come back next term.
So what else did we get on that redistricting case?
Well, we really got very little in terms of substance. The court's order didn't elaborate on exactly what more they wanted to hear, what their issues were. We could tell from the argument that the justices were grappling with all sorts of complicated questions about when a legislature draws these district maps. Can it take race into account of the voters? Does it have to take race into account? If it takes race into account, is that a problem? Were there other ways to draw this district in a more race-neutral way? These are very very difficult, granular, thorny questions. And I think the justices were really wrestling with them at the argument. Certainly that was what appeared to be implicit in a lot of their questions. And at the end of the day, what they said was, you know something, we just don't have enough information to decide this case right now. We want everyone to come back next term and re-argue the case, and we'll issue a decision then.
Oh, goodness. We'll see what happens then. Tom Dupree, thank you so much for your time. All right, take a live look at the White House right now because President Trump is going to hold a press conference shortly. This is about the Supreme Court decision on birthright citizenship, which really is about nationwide injunctions. So as soon as that press conference begins, we're bringing it to you right here on CBS News 24/7. We'll be right back.
What happens when you get conversation over conflict?
I think they've taught me to have grace and compassion.
When we follow the human side of the headline.
I'm not asking that we ignore disability, rather that we do not ignore ability.
When news takes you where the story happens.
We've just crossed into Lebanon.
When the world's best journalists come together to cover your world, you get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight. It's the most popular F word in Washington, fraud.
Is it true that the Social Security number of just about every single American is available for sale on the dark web?
An eye-opening 60 Minutes report.
That's chilling.
It's time for 60 Minutes.
Your life is still a mystery.
When your gut tells you something fishy's going on, there's almost always a 4-day-old carp lying around somewhere. Finishing this is the only thing that's important to me. Either way, the truth is coming out.
Heading home? Who the hell are you, Madeline Matlock?
Matlock. All episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus and returning CBS Fall.
Sunday morning, we hail a driverless taxi, plus billionaire Barry Diller's revealing new memoir, and when trash becomes art, this Sunday morning.
Politics isn't a game. When do consumers actually get to touch and feel a difference in their lives? Politics is about policy. So you would encourage Democrats to work with Donald Trump on an issue like healthcare? I'm a voracious consumer of information, and I'm impatient. I don't like to be spun. Do you know if there are active terror cells in the United States right now? To be moderator of Face the Nation means bringing the most powerful stakeholders to the table to become better informed.
It was almost like being face-to-face with the devil.
48 Hours reports.
I fought and fought.
911, what is your emergency?
She disappeared off the face of the earth.
Stream 48 Hours, 24/7.
Elspeth, I thought I saw you. And then I thought, well, who else could it be? Dressed as a member of the Lollipop Guild.
I work with the police. I like my outlandish theories with a heavy dose of evidence. Nice alibi, by the way.
Can you be careful with that?
Whoever did this is still out there. And I do love a mystery.
Elsbeth. All episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus and returning CBS Fall.
We continue our breaking news coverage of the flurry of decisions issued by the Supreme Court as it wraps its 2024 to 2025 session. Today, a major ruling on President Trump's use of an executive order to end birthright citizenship in the U.S. We begin there with CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, thank you for joining us today. Tell us about some of the real-world ramifications of today's rulings.
Good morning, Muga. Well, this could very well prove to be a major legal victory for the Trump administration's aggressive efforts to change long-standing federal policy, including on immigration, because as you know, Mugo, because we have discussed these rulings on multiple occasions, nationwide injunctions have become a major legal obstacle for the administration's immigration agenda, with judges across the country blocking many of its efforts, including obviously on its attempt to deny birthright citizenship to the children of immigrants who are here illegally, and also on temporary visas. But this ruling, which of course curbs, curtails, and limits these nationwide injunctions by federal judges, could really pave the way for the administration, Mugo, to follow through on many of these policy changes. The caveat, of course, in this specific case is that the legal question about whether or not birthright citizenship and the administration's attempt to upend the long-standing interpretation of that is legal and constitutional is still to be decided and will continue to be litigated in federal courts across the country. That is not a settled question, but obviously now the Department of Homeland Security, state and other federal agencies can actually implement and at least release the guidance on how they would enforce this order across the country. Mugo.
Of course. And we want to take another live look at the White House right now, because we are waiting to hear from President Donald Trump after this ruling from the Supreme Court. As soon as that news conference begins, we'll bring it to you right here on CBS News 24/7. Let's get back to you, Camilo, because again, that's the live shot there at the White House. But let's get back to you, Camilo. I want to ask you about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. That's the man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador and then brought back here, but then he's still being held by the U.S. government. He was only charged with human smuggling after he was deported to El Salvador. What's the basis for those charges?
Well, before we get to that, Mugo, I just want to alert our audiences on a big development in this case, because we actually expected Kilmar Abrego Garcia to be released from federal criminal custody today pending that criminal trial and to be detained subsequently by immigration authorities or ICE pending a deportation potentially to a third country. But now his lawyers have asked the federal district court in Nashville overseeing that criminal case to keep their client in federal criminal custody for the time being, while the federal government clarifies its intentions on whether or not it actually intends to deport Mr. Abrego Garcia to a third country before the criminal trial starts, or if it intends to keep him in ICE detention while that criminal trial is adjudicated in Nashville. So that is a big question. The lawyers are concerned, Mugo, that the administration could be planning to circumvent in many ways the criminal trial and just remove him to a third country without actually having that case in Nashville completed. That case, going back to your original question, Mugo, centers around allegations that Mr. Abrego Garcia allegedly transported and smuggled undocumented immigrants from Latin America into the U.S., that he transported some of them from the Texas border to Maryland, where he lived with his U.S. citizen child and wife, and that he did so multiple times, in the process breaking anti-smuggling laws in the U.S., Mugo.
Okay. Camilo Montoya Galvez, thank you so much for that breakdown. Appreciate it. And now let's bring in CBS News' Jessica Levison. She is a legal contributor and professor at Loyola Law School. Jessica, thank you for joining us today. What do you make of that majority opinion written by Justice Amy Coney Barrett on the birthright citizenship case and what we heard in the dissenting opinions?
I think two really different views of what we should be the most worried about. When it comes to the majority, obviously the majority said that it's likely that these universal or nationwide injunctions are improper, that they exceed the scope of a judge's authority. And when it came to the dissent, what they were really worried about is what happens on the ground with respect to this particular executive order. Maybe just to back up for a second, I know we've been talking about it all morning, but the question in the case was really, when you go into federal court and you challenge an executive order, what relief can you get? Can you get relief just for the people in court, just for the parties challenging the executive order, or can you get relief nationwide? The court today said these nationwide injunctions, they're likely improper. I do think that the court is saying here that Congress could go back and provide judges with this power, But for now, what we have is the court saying basically use a different method of challenging these executive orders. If you want broader relief, then use something like a class action. So the majority really focused on their concern of judges exceeding their power. And then again, to reiterate, we have the dissent here really concerned about the idea that what happens when executive orders are implemented and what happens to people on the ground. I will say that the court went to pains to say this isn't about birthright citizenship.
Right.
This is not saying that the executive order about birthright citizenship is constitutional. I think there's very little chance the court would ever say that. This is about the scope of relief that you get whenever you challenge an executive order.
But Jessica, now the question is there ever now a way to get a nationwide injunction? How would that work? Would everyone need to be involved in a specific case that's going before a judge?
Great question. And I think what the court is leaning on here is the idea of you can get this broader relief. You just can't go as a single plaintiff or a group and say, I want a nationwide injunction. You have to go through the process, the requirements of asking for class certification. And then you could have a federal judge granting much broader relief while the court plays out. While the case plays out. We should remind everybody that this is really about what happens in the first instance. You go into federal court and you say there's a problem with this executive order. What type of immediate and sometimes temporary relief can you get? To your question, I still think there's the power for broad relief. It's just take a different route to get there.
Yeah. And I also wanted to get your take on the Supreme Court's ruling that parents can choose to opt their kids out of lessons that include LGBTQ plus books.
Yeah, this was an important case dealing with the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. And this is a court that's been very protective of religious objectors. In this case, parents who have said, we need notice or an ability to opt out before our kids are read certain books. Now, what I thought was fascinating about the majority opinion is that they cited to these books and they said that these books are essentially pushing an agenda. Now, I think that as I tried to very quickly read the opinion, it does not appear that the opinion opens the door for now parents can challenge any aspect of a school's curriculum. I don't think the court wants to allow that. The court doesn't want to allow parents to say, we don't want our kids to learn algebra, or we don't want our kids to learn, about history, geometry, for instance.
Right.
So it looks to me, again, quickly reading, it's a very busy morning, that this is about these particular books, this set of facts, and the idea that there used to be an opt-out provision and there should be one here again.
Okay. Jessica Levinson, thank you so much for your insight. All right, we're taking another live look right now at the White House. You see reporters and correspondents there right now, and that is because we are waiting to hear from President Trump. Any moment now, he's going to head to that podium for a press briefing after this ruling from the Supreme Court on nationwide injunctions. But at this moment, let's go to Capitol Hill and congressional correspondent Nicole Killian. Nicole, thank you for joining us today. I'm trying to see what's going on out there, any responses so far, especially about this ruling from the Supreme Court.
Well, yes, certainly we are starting to hear a reaction from some lawmakers. We asked Speaker Mike Johnson a short time ago for his reaction, but he said he had not had a chance to read the decision. But in his defense, the House just held a vote. They also had a briefing with national intelligence officials. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt there. But we did see a statement a short time ago from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus blasting the decision. Obviously, this is kind of a contentious point here in Congress because we have seen legislation on the part of many congressional Republicans similarly trying to bar these types of injunctions in district courts from being imposed on a national level. So I expect that we will continue to see Republicans coming out in support of this decision, whereas Democrats certainly are likely to remain concerned about the issue.
All right, Nicole. And we know today, senators, they will vote on a war powers resolution. Does this resolution, as of this moment, have enough support from both sides of the aisle?
Well, it remains to be seen. You know, it doesn't require a 60-vote threshold, just a simple majority, which means 51 senators would need to support it. But look, this is a measure that Senator Tim Kaine put forth ahead of those U.S. strikes that the president ordered. And we have seen other similar measures introduced here in Congress. You know, many lawmakers, including some on the other side of the aisle, have expressed concerns that they didn't get any notification ahead of these strikes, that Congress does have a role to play here when it comes to the declaration of war and using military force. So that is kind of what this resolution sets to address, especially if further strikes with respect to Iran are warranted, although as of yet we don't know that to be the case. So we will see how this plays out. But of course, this comes on the heels of both the Senate and the House being briefed, as I mentioned a short time ago, on those strikes in Iran. You know, many Republicans continue to back the administration's assessment that those Iranian nuclear facilities were destroyed, significantly damaged and set back. But Democrats continue to have questions and are seeking more information.
And let's get to the so-called big, beautiful bill. We know the Senate parliamentarian rejected more provisions in that bill, and it comes after a Medicaid provision was rejected just yesterday. So what is the latest roadblock here?
Well, I don't know if it's a roadblock per se. It's just that senators, well, more particularly the Senate Majority Leader John Thune, is ready to move this bill, but he's kind of at the mercy of the Senate parliamentarian. I mean, this is a massive package. The House version of this bill was more than 1,000 pages, so all of these different provisions have to be scrubbed in the Senate by the parliamentarian because they're using a budget process known as reconciliation. So every provision has to meet these specific budgetary guidelines. And so we have seen the parliamentarian continue to strike down various provisions. Yesterday, we talked about this issue of the Medicaid provider taxes, which had been a big sticking point with Republicans. And then today we saw the parliamentarian strike down a provision that would have removed regulations for gun silencers and other firearms, which some may wonder why would that be in the bill to begin with. But, you know, sometimes with these big pieces of legislation, there are different provisions tucked in unrelated. So that is the most recent thing to be struck down. Whether or not that holds up the bill is unlikely. But we know that the parliamentarian continues to work through the bill, most notably a lot of the tax portions of the bill, which is really the cornerstone of this package. Right. So until that work is finished, the Senate cannot move forward with a vote.
All right. Nicole Killian, live for us on Capitol Hill. Thank you so much for that analysis. All right, we are waiting for President Trump to take the podium you see here, and that is because he's going to discuss this Supreme Court ruling on nationwide injunctions. As soon as that news conference begins, we'll bring it to you live right here on CBS News 24/7. Stay with us.
We're NCIS.
Do you guys want to see me do the cha-cha slide?
Can we get to the body, please?
Right.
Oh, what's got you so punchy lately?
Not punchy. Passionate. This is a great team for what? We're NCIS.
NCIS, all episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus and returning CBS Fall.
No matter how you start your day, one thing is clear.
Actually, two things. Pretty sure it's three.
Guys, whether it's news, money, health, or wellness, sports, movies, or even inspiration.
Clearly, CBS Mornings is the place to be. That's like 7 things.
Okay, clearly, I'm bad at math, always been. Clearly, CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7 on CBS.
We can start whenever you're ready.
Ready?
Yeah.
No, stop! Wrong pedal, wrong other pedal! Oh, he's in a wheelchair! What do you want? Not stop the car! That's a kid! Kid! Give it to me. Did I pass?
Now serving 942.
go to the ends of the earth.
We'll hit the heights.
A great adventure together.
And reach for the stars.
Star power. I like it.
So cool.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking.
Something that's undeniable.
With mindfulness.
Innovative.
Magical.
It's like being a child.
And truly original reporting.
How'd you do your research?
I tell a good story.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
Hi, CBS. I'm Tom Ellis. I can't wait for you to see my new show, CIA, coming CBS Fall.
What happens when the world's best journalists come together?
Write a prescription for the healing of America.
You get the stories of America every weeknight. You get the all-new CBS Evening News.
When everything's on the line, real heroes rise to the occasion. Or die trying. We're firefighters. We're gonna find a way to get you out of here.
We take the hits together.
We're on the same team.
I'm right here with you, no matter what.
I would never leave you hanging in the deep end.
This place is a way of giving you new family.
Fire Country. All episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus and returning CBS Fall.
All right, we're taking another live look at the White House right now. We're waiting for President Trump to get to the podium you see there. He's expected to hold a news conference. This after that landmark Supreme Court ruling on nationwide injunctions. Basically, the Supreme Court justices in a 6-3 ruling said that lower courts, they don't necessarily have the ability to issue nationwide injunctions. So this is a big, big win for the Trump administration. The case originally went to the Supreme Court. The question was about birthright citizenship. The justices did not answer that question. It was more about nationwide injunctions, and again, their decision being that federal courts, one federal judge does not have the rights to issue a nationwide injunction. Okay, let's get you some headlines around the world right now, and we're going to start with this in Texas. That is a woman there with a gun standing in a lawn chair in the middle of the North Freeway. It caused a major backup on Thursday afternoon and sparked an hours-long standoff with authorities. Officers say that woman had been involved in a crash before taking out that chair. The altercation, thankfully, it ended peacefully here with the woman dropping her weapon and hugging one of the negotiators. She was taken into custody after surrendering. Police officers say the woman is 64 years old and has a history of mental illness. When a wide turn goes left. Yeah, this electrical worker walked away with only minor injuries after he was nearly flipped out of his lift truck. It happened after he was hit by the top of an 18-wheeler that made a wide turn while passing through a traffic light. Luckily, the man was strapped in, so he did not have to go to the hospital. Denham Springs police say they are investigating whether or not charges will be filed in that incident. And wild video to our monitors. This is out of Seoul, South Korea. This is the moment a man doused the floor of a subway and lit it on fire in a packed car. That's crazy video. Passengers can be seen rushing to get away. 6 people were injured. On Tuesday, prosecutors said they indicted the 67-year-old suspect who was charged in the May 31st incident. The charges: attempted murder and arson. Iran's supreme leader made his first televised address since the U.S. brokered ceasefire between Israel and Iran went into effect. He claimed victory over Israel and said Iran's missiles targeted many of Israel's military and other targets, though in reality, few actually evaded Israel's air defense, with some hitting apartment buildings. Meanwhile, we are starting to see life slowly come back in Iran as the country held its first Friday prayers since the ceasefire. CBS News senior foreign correspondent MTS Tayyab has reaction from the capital of Iran.
Well, we're here at Iran's main university here in the capital, Tehran. As you can see, thousands have gathered for Friday prayers. This is the first Friday prayer since the ceasefire was called after that, frankly, deadly 12-day war with Israel, which saw the U.S. target 3 of Iran's main nuclear facilities. Now, as is expected in times like this, people here, who are often described as hardliners, will chant phrases like "Death to America" and "Death to Israel." And we've been coming to Iran for some time now, and the anger here is palpable. This